Let me begin by saying that the next session, which is a very interesting session on land as collateral for access to credit in India, will again, unfortunately, have only 2 papers, despite the fact that 3 were listed. A casualty again to COVID. We've had a number of presenters. Today, we've had 2 presenters who have not been able to come because of COVID, and a third just barely made it. Charu has been down and has managed to come back and make a presentation today. So I'm sorry we'll miss that third paper, but I'm sure we will make available those papers which were missed out today at a subsequent date with all the details which have been researched in those. Let me begin by introducing Professor Kundu, who will be chairing this session, this last session of day 3 of this workshop. Professor Kundu, as many of you will know, has had a long and very distinguished career as an academic economist, deeply involved in public policy on a variety of areas, ranging from urban affairs, statistics, labor economics, and of late even sanitation. He has been a professor at JNU, as many of you will know. He has been a visiting professor at Amsterdam, at Sciences Po in Paris, at Collateral and Würzburg in Germany. He has and continues to head numerous official committees. He has 35 books and over 300 research articles to his credit. Currently, he is Distinguished Fellow at the Research and Information Systems for Developing Countries. Welcome, Professor Kundu, and thank you very much for agreeing to our request to chair this session. Professor Kundu has requested me to introduce the authors today and the discussant and the authors also today. So I'll take the liberty of doing that before handing over to Professor Kundu. The discussant today is equally distinguished. Namita Wahi, who heads the Land Rights Initiative at the Center for Policy Research, is not only a dear friend and colleague of many years now on land issues, but has a very distinguished career, as many of you would know. She's a lawyer by profession and an academic lawyer now, but did her law at India's premier law school in Bangalore, the National Law School in Bangalore, has thereafter gone on to do a PhD from Harvard, and after practicing law in New York, has favored the idea of coming back and setting up the Land Rights Initiative at CPR, which really does some phenomenal work on land laws in India. Thank you, Namita, for agreeing to be with us and to be the discussant for the papers in this session.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks. Let me also introduce the speakers today, the authors. So we have Susan Thomas presenting a paper in this session on how credit impacts or does not impact the quality of land records impact credit. Susan has a PhD from the University of Southern California, Los Angeles, after obtaining a BTech from the IIT Mumbai. She's currently faculty at the IGIDR, has distinguished herself by working on markets, especially share markets, and has of late forayed into land, which is fortunate for us, given her immense ability to dissect and make contributions on all her academic work. She has published extensively, and we are happy that she has co-authored this work with Diya Uday, who has a law degree from Symbiosis, is currently also a colleague of Susan's, and is a visiting faculty at TIS. The second paper today is co-authored by Aparna, who just chaired the last session, with Anindita Mukherjee, who's also a senior researcher at CPR. Anindita, who has earlier worked with GIZ, has 17 years of experience of working on urban development land and urban slums and associated matters. We are really glad and very pleased that both these papers are being presented in this session. With this introduction, I would like to hand over to Professor Amitabh Kundu to take forward this session. Thank you, Professor Kundu, for agreeing to be with us today.
Thank you, Deepak, for your kind words. I must say it's an honor and privilege for me to be a part of this panel discussion, and I'm anxiously looking forward to the presentation, although I have gone through the papers, which happily doesn't happen very often. Papers were made available well in time. But let me begin by congratulating NCAER, not for just this India Land Forum 2020, but taking this whole land policy initiative. This was very much needed in this country. The land records, their digitization, modernization, and what is the impact of this digitization, modernization on the legal administrative processes. And I'm very happy about the work which has been done by NCAER in constructing the index, which has been used in one of the papers in a very important manner. I must say, I've been a user of some of the indices that NCAER puts forward in terms of investment climate and all that. So as far as this land-related index is concerned, the components, I'm not very clear, but I'm certainly looking forward to that. The textual record, the spatial record, registration, quality of the record, how the administrative and the governance environment, whether they are also captured or not, I would certainly like to hear that. But certainly it's a work which is very, very commendable. I would like to put on record my appreciation for Professor Uday, Deepak, our old friend of mine. Friendship is very old, Devendra Gupta, and many others. And certainly, I'm very excited about my association with this event. And may I go in the same order? And may I request Diya, Uday, to make the presentation? Is that what would happen? Or Susan would start it? Can we have the first presentation on quality of land records and credit access?
Thank you very much, Professor Kundu. I'm Diya Uday, and I will be presenting.
Please go ahead.
Just give me a second.
Take 15 to 20 minutes, or we have some time, but let's use that time for discussion on some of the critical issues. As I said, I'm very excited to learn more. So take maximum 20 minutes so that we can have rest of the time for discussion.
Sure.
Please.
Is my presentation visible?
Yeah, I can see that.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, to the NCAER team for having us here and organizing this workshop. It's been very interesting so far, and we're really looking forward to the upcoming sessions as well. So today I'm going to be presenting some early stage work that Susan and I have begun to look at, where we are attempting to examine the linkage between the quality of the land records infrastructure and household access to credit. I'm going to begin by setting the context for the work that we're doing, talk about our research question, the data and design of our studies so far. I'll take you through some early stage findings we have, as well as our takeaways, and talk about some of the limitations of our present work and some future work that we've planned to do on the paper. Now, if you were to look at the Indian household portfolio today, you would see that among others, there are three unusual features that set them apart from their counterparts in other countries. Okay, so the first is that real estate assets have a significantly high presence in the Indian household portfolio, and it's estimated that this is approximately 77% of the total asset holding. Now, to give you an idea, if we were to compare this with the asset holding in terms of real estate for other developing countries like China and Thailand, we'd see that they fall between 55 and 60%. The second is that a significant portion of the debt of the Indian household is unsecured, and it's estimated that this is approximately 56% of the total liabilities of a household. And lastly, mortgage loans themselves are a very small part of the total liabilities in a household portfolio, and it's approximately about 23%. Now, if we were to compare this with other developing countries like China and Thailand, we'd see that generally the mortgage loans are almost commensurate with the real estate asset holdings. So, why is this unusual? Typically, where there is information asymmetry about the credit worthiness of a borrower, that is their ability to repay, lenders tend to place a greater reliance on collateral as a means with which they seek to either mitigate or lower their risk in lending. Now, land in the literature we see is a preferred source of collateral typically because of many reasons. Some of them are the fact that it's easily identifiable, you can value it easily, as well as the fact that its value doesn't depreciate over time as much as perhaps other assets do. However, we see a paradox in India where, despite having a high percentage of real estate assets, unsecured debt is high, and real estate assets are being underutilized as collateral. Now, for those of us who study access to finance, we know that this could be on account of many reasons, both demand and supply side. However, one of the potential reasons for this, or that could contribute to this paradox, is the quality of the land records infrastructure. Okay, and we see suggestions of this both in the literature as well as in policy discourse. So how do the land records infrastructure potentially affect credit access? One way could be that they either contribute to or create information asymmetries, which is that lenders often either don't have access to information about land, or even when they have access, the information is not sufficient for them to make a lending decision. The second could be that it increases transaction costs, that is the cost of doing the actual lending transaction for to procure information perhaps. And second, in terms of enforcement, if there is a default in the loan, then a lender should ideally be able to sell the asset easily and at a low cost. And perhaps the land records infrastructure affects its use, the use of collateral by increasing transaction costs. Now, while we see suggestions of a linkage in the literature, there is a dearth of literature that seeks to examine this question empirically, and that's what we are attempting to begin to do here, where we're looking at whether the quality of the land records infrastructure affects a household's access to credit.
Have we lost contact?
If indeed we are seeing some evidence of a link between the quality of the land records infrastructure and credit access of households, it perhaps supports the case for policy efforts to improve the land records infrastructure. So how do we do this? How do we attempt to do this? We attempt to do this by exploiting the heterogeneity that exists in the quality of the land records infrastructure across Indian states. So what do I mean by this? I mean that today we know that land record governance is decentralized in India at the level of the state. And therefore, because different states have control over the governance of the quality of the land records infrastructure, there is a natural variation that seems to occur. And that's what we are planning to, that's what we use in our study. We use two novel data sets, which is NCER's LRSI and CMI's Consumer Pyramids Household Survey data for this analysis. So I'll just quickly tell you a little bit about the data that we're using. The LRSI, as we know, is a survey done by NCAER. We have 1 year of information as of now. It's been done across 33 states. And what we use from this are aggregate state level scores, which have been assigned between 0 and 100 across four main components, which are textual records, spatial records, registration, and quality of records. And what do these attempt to capture? They look at parameters which may be bucketed into two main categories. One is access to information. So they ask questions such as what is the extent of digitization? And the second is ease of doing transactions. So yeah, and this is what they do for registration as well. The second source of data that we use is the consumer pyramids data, which is survey-based data, which is collected across 175,000 households, which are surveyed thrice a year. And here we use information such as the households that have borrowings, sources of borrowings. So for the level of our present analysis, we have divided sources of borrowings across formal sources and informal sources. And informal sources, we include sources of borrowing such as borrowings from banks, microfinance institutions, NBFCs, and so on. And in informal sources of lending, informal sources of borrowing, we categorize borrowings from friends and family, employers, money lenders, and so on. We have also currently used information on household level borrowing, as well as the location of the household, that is the state that the household belongs to, as well as whether they belong to an urban or rural area. We have two main hypotheses here. The first is that better land records infrastructure, which reflects in a higher LRSI score, should ideally enable higher access to credit. And the second is it should also enable higher access to formal sector credit. So in our approach, what we are doing is we are measuring access to credit by the fraction of households in a state that are considered borrower households. Okay, and for this we use three main variables. We use the fraction of households in a state with any borrowing as compared to the total number of households in that state. We then look at the fraction of households with borrowing from only formal sources, and we also look at the fraction of households with borrowing only from informal sources. We have attempted to test the strength of the correlation between the state level borrower households and state level LRSI scores. Our analysis so far is not a causal one, but what is new is that we use quantitative measures for measuring the land records infrastructure by way of the LRSI score. We also use data which has frequent observations of household credit access, and this is done thrice a year. So the information we're using on household behavior is current. And lastly, both of these measures allow us to enable to capture some state level variation. So what we are attempting here is a multi-state empirical analysis which links or attempts to look at the linkage between credit access and the land records infrastructure in India. On our downsides, however, we have unfortunately no direct observations of the actions or choices of lenders as yet. And what we use is a proxy for access to credit, which is the household balance sheet. We also have only one observation for the land records infrastructure at present, and we therefore can't capture any variations, but we intend to do this in the future, perhaps. So what are we seeing right now? Here are some of our initial findings. Okay, if we were to just look at the data without applying any correlations analysis, what you're seeing here is that we have divided states as high LRSI scoring states and low LRSI scoring states. And in the table in front of you, we have put about 6 states in each category to give you a flavor of the initial results that we are seeing. If we look at the high LRSI scoring states, we do see a higher percentage of households that are borrower households in the high LRSI states vis-a-vis the low LRSI states. Okay. However, there are some exceptions here. So for example, there appear to be some sort of state level variations. Now we see that in Chandigarh and Kerala, for example, the level of borrowing, so the level of borrower households is higher than in a state like Orissa, despite the fact that Orissa perhaps has a better quality of land records infrastructure than Chandigarh or Kerala as per the LRSI. Again, if we look at households that have borrowings from both informal and formal sources, overall we are seeing a higher percentage of borrower households in states with higher LRSI scores vis-a-vis lower LRSI scores. But here too, there seems to be some state variation, especially where Orissa is concerned. We then are interested in looking at formal versus informal borrowing sources, because the idea is that with better quality of land records infrastructure, you should ideally have a higher percentage of households borrowing from formal sources versus informal sources, because it will allow you to use land as collateral. We are seeing that there are a higher percentage of borrower households who only borrow from formal sources in high LRSI states versus low LRSI states. One thing that we are also seeing, however, is a high percentage of borrowings from only informal sources, which is counterintuitive. However, this could also be because we're just seeing the overall levels of borrowing to be higher in high LRSI states vis-a-vis low ones. Now, what we have attempted to do is apply a correlations analysis to the data that I just presented. And in our models, what we have done so far is capture endogeneity using two control variables. One is state level GDP, and we use state level GDP as a proxy for household income. The assumption here is that households with better income will have better access to credit because they're more credit worthy. The second is that we use property ownership as a control variable as well, where we see that, where we assume that households with higher levels of property ownership will have better access to credit. So what are we seeing so far? We are seeing that there appears to be a positive correlation between the LRSI score and overall borrowings, or there seems to be a positive correlation between the quality of the land records infrastructure and the percentage of borrowing households in the states. Okay. However, we are seeing a statistically stronger correlation in case of informal borrowings. Now, this is counterintuitive again, because we would expect that with the better quality of land records infrastructure, we'd see a stronger correlation with formal borrowings versus informal, but we're seeing a stronger correlation in case of informal borrowings. We also see a stronger correlation with households that borrow from rural areas vis-a-vis urban, though the variation is not very much between the two. If we examine the correlation across the four components that the LRSI attempts to capture, we see a positive correlation, but not statistically significant results, except in the case of spatial records, where in our models we are seeing consistently statistically significant correlations for spatial records. Again, here it appears that all of these components appear to have statistically more significant or stronger correlations with borrowings from informal sources than formal sources. So what are we seeing so far? We're seeing that there appears to be evidence of a link between the quality of the land records infrastructure and access to credit. We are seeing that informal borrower households appear to have a stronger statistical correlation with the quality of land records infrastructure than formal, and this is counterintuitive. Amongst all the components, we're seeing that spatial records show consistently more significant correlations than any other component. We are seeing that textual records surprisingly don't appear to have so much of a, or as much of a significant correlation. One reason for this could be because, as we know today, textual records are not really evidence of title. Of what they and perhaps lenders, we know anecdotally, don't really rely on textual records but conduct their own due diligence. So any change or improvement in the quality of textual records is not really going to make so much of a difference to household credit. But that's just one potential reason for what we're seeing. It's surprising that we're seeing strong correlations with between spatial records and borrowings, because as we know, typically today a spatial record doesn't really afford any more information than a textual record does. But that's what we're seeing so far. We're also seeing that there doesn't appear to be much difference between the correlation effects in urban and rural regions. So to conclude, I'd like to say that we think that this is an interesting but complex question to study. And I think that it is important for us to just talk about some of the limitations of our present work. One is that our present analysis is aggregated at the level of the state, and what we want to do in the future is design a research, modify our research design to include more information at the level of the household, such as income, expenses, and so on, and that's what we're planning to do. Also, our present analysis doesn't offer any deep understanding of why different components have different levels of importance, it appears. But we do intend to understand what these differences are and attempt to incorporate it into our research design if possible. And lastly, this is possibly one of the first next steps that we'll do, is that incorporate the presence of formal financial firms into the research design, where we also look at whether the presence or the distribution of formal financial institutions across states has anything to contribute to what we are seeing so far. Thank you very much, and I look forward to any comments and questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Diya. Although you took a couple of minutes more, but I thought it is important.
I
Hello?
apologize, Professor.
No, I thought it's important for the people who are listening to your presentation to know about exactly the indicator that you have used and the way the relationship has been estimated. Although perhaps a little more clarity on these four components of this index LRSI would have been perhaps helpful for at least for me to understand exactly how to look at the correlations. What I suggest is that since in both the papers, the issue of land records have figured importantly, let's have both the presentations together. Maybe there will be some common issues. And Namita, I hope you wouldn't mind taking another 5 to 7 minutes after the second presentation to give your comments so that we can then open up the discussion. If this is acceptable,
Sure.
may I then ask the presenters for the second paper, Aparna and Anindita, how do you want to share the time? Aparna, would you like to start?
Yeah, I would start. Thanks, Professor Kundu.
Just take 20 minutes, huh?
Sorry?
Just take 20 minutes for the presentation. Is that okay?
Yeah, is the screen visible?
Yes.
So we will do it jointly. So let me begin and then I will hand it over to Anindita. So so we are basically discussing two terms here, land title and land tenure. And I must say that at the outset that this is based on an experience of a work experience that we had in Odisha, where we worked on behalf of GIZ. Anindita was my colleague at that time. And we did this work in Berhampur and Puri. That was our entry point on that. But this particular work experience that we have, and based on that, we have framed this paper. Okay. So Anindita, maybe you can go to the next slide, please. Yeah. So what has been talked about is that land titling, tenure security has a linkage with poverty reduction. And this has been talked a lot and about by GLTN, UN Habitat, and many other multilateral and bilateral agencies. And we were also taking that same path. And what we wanted to see is that has land titling, when you give the land title, does it really facilitate access to institutional credit for the beneficiaries or the urban poor for whom these land titles are being conferred to? Is there any kind of a direct linkage there? That is one. And the second one is that how does this link up, this particular intervention link up with the statutory city planning processes? Is there a link, or is it something that is completely in parallel? And here, maybe, I come from the spatial planning discipline. And in my work all these years, we have been doing spatial planning, but revenue administration is not something that I have ever engaged with before, but only, when this entire tenure security comes, there we start engaging. So I think that these two disciplines are in parallel. That is my personal experience. And these two knowledge domains are not crisscrossing anywhere. So this was also our interest to know that, how does this link up, this tenure titling processes and city statutory planning processes. So what is our work is based on? We did a lot of literature review, learned from the global experiences. That was one source of information for us. And the second source of information is we conducted empirical study, and this is the study that was done jointly by GIZ and CPR. And this key findings also forms a basis of this paper. Yeah. So when we started first working on it in the initial, 2015, when PMAY was announced, and we started working on it, and our task was to figure out how we can promote or get more and more people into the ambit of beneficiary-led construction. That is one of the vertical of PMAY. That was our task. And we were struggling with the urban local body and the state administration to get more and more people in that particular ambit. But the restriction was that you have to have de jure right. You have to have that legal paper, the record of rights. Until unless you have that, it is not possible for to unlock the subsidy. So what we started advocating at that time is that, is it possible to use other surrogates or other forms of it? Is it possible to make it a bit more lenient? So this is the advocacy that we were doing. While we were doing that, we also realized, and we documented it very thoroughly, that what is the continuum of tenure that exists on the ground. And what we found is that actually it is not that people were encroachers. They were actually the real owners, but they may not have the that last piece of ROR, because it is a bit of a cumbersome processes to get the mutation done. Sometimes they do not perceive any need to have the mutation. So there were many issues with it. So not that they were encroachers on a public land or anything, but we found that most of them were actually owners, but they have different degrees of legal papers. So it was basically ranging from absolutely no legal rights, formal rights, to the full formal rights. So there was this continuum that was existing, and that is what we recorded. And then our advocacy was based on that, till what level one can waive off, and how we can get more and more people in the ambit of BLC. However, this just one second. Yeah, whatever the talk that we had with the administration, but it seems that there has been a strong influence of this de jure. Although there is a tenure security and a tenure continuum has been discussed, but when it comes to implementation, it is always that one has to have a de jure titles. That is a kind of a, once we have that, then everything would be sorted. And to us, it seems that the De Soto's assumptions, or De Soto's kind of a, philosophy is very much entrenched in the system, and it is being used by the administration, and the work has been done towards that. Although there has been also a discussion on the continuum. But when it comes to implementation, that is the De Soto's way of thinking seems to be the major or an overarching way of thinking about land tenure. Yeah, please. So what we found is that, when we did our literature survey, that world globally, and especially in the global south, it has never worked. So we studied the case study of Peru in detail, and we found that even after having the legal title, these people could not access the institutional credit because there were other concerns that came up. So if you are a poor, then there are other concerns like your social positioning, your negotiation skills, your many other things, your income proof, documentation of that. There are other things that are being held against one in giving the credit. So although they did give the legal title, but it didn't work out what the purpose for that legal title was, to unlock the institutional credit. So this is something that, we also feel that it has been other case studies also saying the same thing. But this assumption that it would work in Odisha is not being, this is not being questioned. So there's no learning from the global experiences. And the second is that when the poor again, takes loan on a higher interest rate, it also they get into a debt trap. So that these are the things that I think, for what has been from the global study, we figure it out. Coming to the spatial planning part of it, what we found is that at least globally or in the Latin American countries, there has been some linkages with the spatial planning of cities and this land titling processes. And there are instruments that are being made on zoning and all those stuff, which is not reflecting when we were coming to the Indian context. So this recognition that formal title and an improvement of the infrastructure, if it happens, then only people perceive that they are more secure, and only titling is not good enough to give that perception. Are the things that is being that is what we didn't experience at the ground level. So these are the kind of, I'm not going point by point, but I'm just saying that, we tried to understand one from access to institutional finance, and then access to this spatial planning instruments that could have been used after titling to leverage the land-based financing tools or other kind of financing tools for the city as a whole that could have used. Yeah, please next. This is something that needs further exploration, and what we found in that in the Latin American countries, there is a kind of a continuum. Continuously, there is a pattern that is emerging where land titling and spatial planning are getting quite linked. So one is using those instruments to create and to create some resources for the city. What we studied in detail is the city statute of Brazil and also the Ecuador, where GIZ is engaged in doing that work. And we found that this may be a possibility for us, where spatial planning and access to credit and land titling could be interlinked and could be, there could be some kind of a synergy there. And maybe this is the missing link right now, that we are doing this two parts of ownership and then the spatial planning in two different parallel paths. So this is something that we would like to further explore on. And we did a lot of study on this Brazil part and the Ecuador part. Yeah. Now I get down to the our experience with Odisha. So in 2015, when PMAY was announced and GIZ decided to work on the BLC part of it, and what we found that in our cities in Odisha, there is the municipality was struggling to get enough people under the BLC ambit. And also these were not done as a area-based approach. This was like a list of people who were eligible, and it was basically unlocking the subsidy for them. And at that time, there was an advocacy to use surrogate or to make the processes lenient, but it somehow felt that the revenue department was not really very willing to cooperate, or for whatever administrative reason. So HUDD, Housing and Urban Development Department, who were in the lead for that, they took a very bold step and instituted this Odisha Land Rights to Slum Dwellers Act. And under that act, a lot of land rights certificates were distributed, and that allowed them to unlock the PMAY subsidy. So the study that Anindita would now take forward is on the 3 cities where we did this study, and then we'll figure it out with that, what actually happened when this was implemented there. So over to you, Anindita.
Thanks. Thank you, Aparna. So what we did was we were intrigued and we tried to understand whether this land right certificate distribution enabled better access to housing subsidy as well as access to finance, and also try and understand whether they were marginalized because of the delinking with the spatial planning project. And in doing that, we undertook a sample survey, a primary household sample survey across 250 households in 3 cities of Odisha: Beharampur, Gopalpur, and Dhenkanal. So on the institutional financing, I was very intrigued by Diya's analysis, and kind of explains a little bit through this bottom-up study as well, is that financing, even when LRC was given, wasn't available for the poorer sections. A simple plot, simple correlation shows us that, you know, better the MPCE, the higher is the chance to get a formal loan. And poorer people in the lowest quintiles were actually 2 times more susceptible to actually fall into the informal borrowing segment. So then we also asked that, this borrowing was majorly done to finance their share of the housing improvement that they could access by getting this LRC. So there is a loop there. And this housing finance for themselves, for their share of the input, was done majorly through informal borrowing, which started with friends and relatives, and the most predominant were friends and relatives, followed by money lender and employer at various stages. While we were trying to understand why they did not apply for a formal source loan from the banks, lengthy application processes, excessive requirement of collaterals, absence in bank in the close proximity, and risk of repossession in case of default is what were the highly important factors that were pointed out by the households in resorting to the informal borrowing. Another key problem that we kind of identify is the land rights certificates that are given to in the name of the women of the household, because the previous section was about access to land for women. There is no registration process that is followed up with this land. So what is happening is these are remaining in the hand of the recipients and not getting updated in the system of the revenue side. And also we try to understand, was there a very tenure insecurity which was going on in Orissa, and only 1% of the households kind of reported that they ever felt any eviction threat. So the LRC is actually not really attributing also to the high tenure perception, but definitely it is solving, giving them a piece of paper to prove their address and making them feel more as part of the formal city, I would say. So this incomplete land titling process, where it is not mutated and not registered, is also, we are feeling, contributing to the lack of basic civic services in the cases of Orissa. While Orissa features very high in digitization of their land records, it seems to be quite static, and these land parcels which are recently given were not really shown up there. Even the civic body are not yet started in providing basic infrastructure to this BLC housing that has been coming up in Orissa upon receiving the LRCs. Another disaggregated assessment of the typology of land ownership, what we saw that mostly the government allotted lands had very limited access to water supply, with most of them dependent on shared water sources outside their premises. And 1 in 3 of the newly built BLC houses lacked a toilet. And mostly cited reasons were lack of funds to build, maintain, and lack of space. The drains and roads were also quite unavailable. However, in Behrampur, given it's a municipal corporation, the coverage of Pakka drains were much higher than the two other smaller cities of Gopalpur and Dhenkara. So the key takeaways that we kind of, from these data sets, there are more data points in the paper, and here we just wanted to focus on the key drivers, is that institutional credit couldn't be unlocked with LRC. While LRC could unlock access to government housing subsidies, but most of the time, to finance these houses, the poorer households are actually getting into a debt trap where Professor Kundu's, borrowing on Professor Kundu's words, they might have to, getting into the debt trap, they might have to forego the asset for which, the very house they might have to forego by defeating the purpose of the land titling. And also this overall master planning process and city planning process, lack of digitization of their record and updating this piece of paper on the registration, on the revenue records, might just lead to the same perpetuation of same state of affairs, barring they might have a upgraded house to pay for significant part of their lives. Aparna, for the recommendations, I would give it back to you.
Yeah, so thanks, Anindita. So what our experience has been and what we think could be possible, and few steps already has.
Aparna, take 3 to 4 minutes, right? To
Yeah,
present.
sure. 3 minutes maybe. So what we found is that the states have already taken few steps. Whatever is here, you can see on the screen. Anindita, would you go to the next slide? Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, so they have no. Sorry. Yeah, here. So, there has been certain steps that is being already taken by the state. One is that forming these groups where they can do a group lending, or they can borrow it as a group. That was being done by the state. There has been this SDAs formed there. And also there has been some kind of a possibility of doing this this credit risk guarantee fund. We have to figure it out how one can use it much more better. I'm not reading out all the things, but there has been possibility of doing certain financial education for the borrower, and also giving them support in doing the estimation and knowing how much would it cost from the very beginning. On the other side, the spatial planning side, I would say that this entire obsession with having a land title, we need to understand it a bit more in that, because it may be possible that in areas where the land market is not so robust, there is a perception of security is very different. So that I think needs a bit more knowledge building on that. Go to the next step, please. And the second one is that there is a possibility of making the spatial planning linked with the land titling, so that one can also leverage on the city's land. And how we do that is also something that needs a further research. This is the one aspect that has not been worked on it as yet, we feel. So the emphasis is more on how the beneficiary can borrow from the market, but if something is being given to them, is it having an impact at the city planning level? That is something of aspect that I think maybe require much more work on that. So I would stop here and hand it over to Professor Kundu. Thank you.
Thank you. I think there's been comprehensive presentation, but I'm sure we'd learn something about the key issues from Namita. Would you take 5 to 7 minutes in flagging certain issues that can be taken up for consideration, or your comments and suggestions with regard to the analysis, methodology, and the conclusions? Namita, time is yours.
Thank you, Professor Kundu, and thank you to the panelists for very rich presentations. I also want to thank the NCAER Land Policy Initiative team, Professor D.V. Gupta, Mr. Sanan, Anika, and others, Professor Bhide, Shekhar, everyone who's put together this show of rich panels and presentations. I really enjoyed both the papers, and I think there was a wonderful synergy about them. And I think that the sort of key points that came out of both the papers, on the one hand from Diya and Susan's paper, the idea that despite a high percentage of real estate assets, unsecured debt is high in India, and real estate assets are underutilized as collateral. Land is underutilized as collateral is the sort of key finding that came out. And at the same time, Anindita and Aparna also brought out a strong reaction to a sort of De Sotoan idea. And, Aparna has already spoken about the De Soto narrative, but, essentially the idea that, very simplistic conception that De Soto puts out in his book, The Mystery of Capital, which is that, what separates the rich and the poor is their ability to unlock capital, right? And it's as simple as that. Like you, and if you can allow people to unlock the value of their collateral, and that's how like you'll get rich. And the argument, simplistic as it is amazing how much influence it has had on policies across the world, and to the extent that Anindita and Aparna's paper pushes back through an on-ground study, a household level survey of people who have benefited from schemes that have actually been conceptualized with that idea is really helpful. So despite the differences in approaches and methodologies of the two papers, one is a very top-down, looking at the state, looking at the Land Record Services Index for the state, and then sort of figuring out household borrowings, to Anindita and Aparna's paper, which sort of goes deep into the Odisha Jaga mission, the housing schemes, the use of housing subsidies for particular things, and who are, the idea that while people may be willing to open bank accounts to get the subsidy, they are not willing to use land as collateral. In fact, they'd rather take loans from friends and family and money lenders than formal banking institutions. So they're quite different papers, but they sort of come to different conclusions. And that's why there's a careful synergy. I just want to make a few points that, there has been a lot of pushback against De Soto in the legal literature. And I think that's because, from my perspective, De Soto fundamentally doesn't understand what property rights mean to lawyers and how we understand that, right? So I just, this is not, so De Soto is the most famous proponent of this, but this is an idea that is there in neoliberal economic theory. And the idea is that essentially clear and strong property rights are a prerequisite to a functioning market economy, and that stronger and more formal property rights would promote efficiency and growth. That is the basic idea, which is there in the literature. And pursuant to that, we have programs, as Diya and Susan point out in their paper, the National Land Records Modernization Program. De Soto actually came to India and met with Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, before these programs were set out. And then following that, the digitalization of land records. And of course, on the other hand, we have the Odisha, Jaga mission and schemes like that. They sort of come directly from this idea. But, as David Kennedy has argued in his paper on some caution about property rights as a recipe for economic development, again, just like De Soto, David Kennedy is not the only person to have pushed back, but I think his paper, and I think it would be valuable for the authors on this panel to refer to it, because it contains a very good summary of the pushback that has been there. And what he brings out is that essentially this idea that strong formal property rights are prerequisite both to the functioning of a market economy and to efficiency and economic growth is more ideological assertion than careful history. And he goes on to show how Western economies have experienced periods of aggressive industrialization and economic growth with a very diverse range of property regimes, and that don't sort of fit within this idea. So that's the first point. The second point is that, and this is how lawyers understand property. So no property law regime is composed solely of rights. There are always lots of reciprocal obligations to the right. And from that, therefore, the law of property simply cannot be developed and cannot be extended to other areas of institutional finance without facing complex questions of social, political, and economic strategy. And I think to some extent, Anindita and Aparna's paper brings that aspect out as well, that you can't really go ahead and implement these programs without really understanding the ground realities of what's going on. So the third point that comes out is that, and this is crucial, property is not about right to a thing. So when we say I have property in land, it doesn't mean that, I have land is a thing to which I have some rights, but rather property describes the relationship between different individuals with respect to a thing. And when we understand property in that way, then land is not just something that is owned by the title holder, but rather land is something on which various groups of people exercise different layers of property rights. And so lawyers understand property as a bundle of rights. And these rights include use, possession, occupancy, title, mortgage, inheritance. And this bundle of rights can be configured in any number of different ways to form different kinds of property regimes. And different countries have had different kinds of property regimes. And within India also, we have different kinds of property regimes. For example, we have laws that prohibit inheritance of land, agricultural land by women. That was presented in the previous paper as well. Now, that is actually a restriction on the inheritance as right of property for a particular group. Similarly, we have laws that actually protect the rights of scheduled tribes, that their land cannot be transferred from scheduled tribes to someone who's not a scheduled tribe. So that is a restriction on the right of transfer. So that doesn't mean that they don't have property right. They still have property right in that land. It's just a different configuration of rights. We have different kinds of rights with respect to property in land in urban areas vis-a-vis rural areas. We have differences across states. There is a different kind of regime with respect to forest rights, and that too is a property right if someone has a forest patta. So when we understand that property is a bundle of rights that can be configured any number of different ways, then we know that it is not, then when we think of land as collateral, um, it means that it's not just a thing that can be used to get a loan, but rather there are lots of groups of people who may have rights over that who have to be included in the conversation before land can be used as collateral. And if we have that understanding, that helps to understand the reality of what your papers are presenting much easier, right? And this insight is particularly important also for the fourth point that I'd like to make here, because it is simply not analytically possible to distinguish between private legal rules which support market transactions on the one hand, as from public law rules that economists often say are distinguished from private law rules and often distort the market. But that's actually not true. In fact, they have to work together, and you simply cannot design any kind of market arrangement without looking into the public law arrangement as well as the political, economic, and social questions. So with those sort of points as the backdrop to the two papers, I mean, I loved reading the papers. They were super interesting. And I loved the fact that they were sort of pushing back against the narrative. So starting first with Anindita and Aparna's paper, which through an empirical study of the ground realities of the Odisha Jaga mission sort of pushes back and, against this narrative. And I think what it really was really important for me is that it brings out the idea that land titling programs do not significantly.
Another couple of minutes. 2-3
Actually,
minutes.
I will need about 3-4 minutes, if that's okay. Yeah. Could not significantly impact notional security of tenure amongst the urban poor, nor facilitate financial inclusion for those at the bottom of the pyramid. And I think that was a very important insight, because they bring out that there are gradations within both rural and urban poor. And I think that that's the sort of a level of insight, and that's the kind of clarity that we need. So I really liked, these very nuanced understandings of the poor, of who can access credit and who cannot, and why they can and why they can't in the paper. I thought that was really interesting. Where I thought the paper could benefit from a little more clarity was in the terminology that it uses. And I think in some ways, the paper is also arguing is the fact that land tenure and land title is used interchangeably. And then somewhere in the paper, you're talking about land rights not being exhaustive, and that rather we need legal empowerment and information. Now, from my perspective, you are also making a terminological confusion in a way, because I don't know what you mean by land rights now. Like, is it by land rights, do you mean title or do you mean tenure? And frankly, for me, the word tenure is just misleading. For me, actually, it's just land rights, different rights, rights of title, rights of use, rights of possession, rights of occupancy. And I think that is part of the problem in the literature that you're referencing, is that they are not clear about what land tenure means. And I think we see this problem, like the historical literature in India that I'm working on, we see this similar kind of confusion, that they use this term proprietary rights, like during British rule, and they use the word tenure, and it just doesn't make sense. And that's sort of the work, part of the work that I'm also doing, is like, what do we actually mean? Like, when you say this, these are the 6 rights: use, possession, occupancy, like, just tell me, what do you mean? And I think that would really help the paper. Then, yeah, I also thought that the paper could benefit from a little bit of restructuring in the sense that there's so many valuable insights from the study of Odisha. I wish you could place that sooner rather than looking at the comparative experience and bring the comparative experience later, because it's just so rich and it takes a while to get to do it in the paper. The third point I want to push the authors to unpack a little bit about what they mean about fear of default. And the reason I say that, because this also comes up in the second paper with Diya and Susan, is that, why are people not using land as collateral? I mean, that's a question I would pose to the second paper authors as well, is that you brought out these correlations, and I will get into that paper in a bit. But what is motivating this fear? And here I would refer you to behavioral science, which talks about when individuals will not act in their self-interest and what are their reasons for doing so. And my own hunch on this is that there is a lot of trauma related to losing land to money lenders and so on, which is historically there, and it has been not just with communities in Orissa, but across the country, not just amongst the poor, but even from the British times, the fact that you would hypothecate to pay the government the land revenue, and then you would lose your land. I think that this is a psychological trauma that is just there, and that prevents people from accessing collateral. The last point I would like to make about the first paper is that access to credit, you say, is about information and legal empowerment. But what about just basic access to, what we call, what Bordeaux called social capital, like so education, access to elite networks, things like that. How does that, there's a lot more that you could perhaps unpack into what, like you've obviously made the argument, made it very well that this is not exhaustive, the land title or land rights. But what else is there? Perhaps you could reflect a little bit more about that. So I'll stop there for the first paper. For the second paper, I had some questions. Again, a really interesting paper, Diya and Susan. I had some questions about, the methodology, because, you are relying on two data sets. And insofar as you are relying on two data sets, you're also relying on the assumptions that were made by those two data sets. And I think it would strengthen your paper to reflect on the questions and criticisms that have been made of those data sets. And I think it's a phenomenal job that NCAER did with putting together the land records index. But there were certain questions that I myself had raised at the time they put it together. For example, some states like Jharkhand, which have placed very high on the land record services index. I had made this point at the launch of the index itself, that Jharkhand, more than half of the land is in the scheduled areas. And, it's not even clear whether those land records have actually been included in evaluating whether, the state of Jharkhand has, and, how much of land in Jharkhand comes within the understanding of the land record services index. Probably more urban land and not a large part of the land. So I'm not sure if, so A, you're building on a data set which is building on certain assumptions. So perhaps at least acknowledge them. And the second thing was that you're controlling for certain variables. And while, of the two that you mentioned, the state level GDP as proxy for household income and property ownership as proxy for borrowing households, I was more convinced by the latter than by the former, because I think it's such a broad sweep of using state level GDP as proxy for household income, because it simply doesn't take into account the interstate differences between people, which might lead to very different findings and correlations as well. Particularly on your finding about urban and rural differences, I was struck by the fact that you did not find differences in correlations, because even on the examples of the exceptions that you give, for example, Chandigarh and Kerala have greater borrowing households compared to Odisha, which has high LRSI. My own sense is Chandigarh being completely urbanized and Kerala having a higher level of urbanization with respect as compared to Odisha, that I think urbanization may have an important role to play in your findings. And the fact that it's not coming out in the correlations perhaps has something to say about the design of the paper, and perhaps something I invite you to look into. Um, and then, yeah. Yeah, then I think, again, like I would, I mean, I think that, in some ways, Anindita and Aparna's paper is very complementary to yours, because you pose these questions that, you come up with this finding that, land is not really being used as collateral. But I would also invite you to go deeper into why you think that might be the case. And I think it's harder to do it from a top-down approach. But I think one of the things that the paper does not talk about is the access to institutional finance. because that is a very important thing. Like, you know, some of the states where you mentioned have high LRSI, you know, Sikkim and Jammu and Kashmir. Jammu and Kashmir actually, you say, has a low LRSI, and I think that's a issue with the LRSI index rather than Jammu and Kashmir, because I think they have very good land records. But states like Sikkim and in the northeast, like how much like access to credit do people have, and how much does that affect? You know, so you've controlled for certain variables, but I think it would be interesting to look at these variables. It will strengthen your paper if after controlling for those variables you came to that same finding. So I think, Professor Kundu, with your permission, I think I'll stop there. And once
Thank
again,
you.
great papers, and I really learned a lot. And happy to talk about them later as well. But thank you so much.
Thank you, Namita, for this very elaborate presentation of the issues and also bringing out some of the commonalities. I don't see any questions which are coming from the participants. Are they displayed on the screen, or do we?
Yeah, there's one question. There's
Maybe
one question.
you can take them up before I must tell you that I was very happy that some of the macroeconomic concerns which are common in both the presentations. First of all, that in India, the mortgage loans constitute a very small percentage of the total borrowing, which is 25%, which is much less than other even developing countries. Secondly, informal borrowing is a large component of the total borrowing. That is also somewhat in contrast with many of the developing countries. The third point that comes up from both the papers, in fact, that land title is not enough. There are other factors. In fact, for giving loans, there is some kind of a responsibility on the bank personnel, and they would like to perhaps get some kind of an assurance in terms of economic status and this relationship and knowledge. I'm not talking about corruption factor, but certainly from the point of view of safety and security of the bank employee themselves, they would like to perhaps go beyond the land record. And it's true that land has not become a commodity or even a freely tradable asset in the Indian context. And that's why you find that the land being a part of the institutional credit is very small. I mean, I think these are the common points, and I think Namita did bring out one very important factor, that how come the land title does not go into the institutional borrowing as a major component. To some extent, to my mind, is a reflection of the judicial system that we have. There are cases pending for 15 to 20 years. Once you have land given, you are not very sure when this will come up. I mean, if the percentage of vacant houses, number of vacant houses is as high as the number of housing shortage in the country. If that's the kind of conclusion comes up, which really shows that there is something wrong with the land and the housing market operation, and certainly a lot needs to be done. And the point that Namita brought out, the historical factors, I was at the Cornell, Kaushik Basu and many others, they were canvassing questionnaire in West Bengal, and they wanted to make sure that the students and the faculty members, when they go to Bengal, they do not fill up the questionnaires without visiting. So they wanted them to get a stamp, if not signature, but the fingerprint. And Pranab Bardhan immediately said, there are hundreds and thousands of Bengali farmers who have lost their land because of the thumb impression. You want them to give a thumb impression for a filling up of a questionnaire. If some of your faculty members or students are corrupt, it is your business, but certainly you can't, because I think the history is very important. People have such memories of their parents, grandparents losing land. Also, I think there is some emotional attachment to land. There is some religious attachment to land. People don't take land as the first thing to go and get institutional credit. They will think twice. Land is something which is very holy. So it's not just a commodity, So these are the factors. And I'm sure that this study that brings out this factor, both the studies, that land title is just one component. There are other things. And the point that Aparna was emphasizing again and again, that along with the land title, some spatial planning. And what does the spatial planning framework give? It gives kind of a certainty about future. If there is a plan within which the land title has been given to certain individual, then you know that in future development will be in a certain course, what kind of business activities will come up, and that gives support to the people who are giving institutional credit. I think these are some of the general concerns, but there are some specific issues which I would like to raise. But let me see how other participants react to it. And I would also like to know how the two paper presenters respond to some of the very important issues that Namita has raised. So what are the questions that have been already flagged by the participants? Can somebody read out? I don't see anything on my screen. If the
You can read them.
authors, if we have the questions, I would like them to take them up.
Professor Kundu, I think there is this Q&A tab on your screen, if it is there, so the questions are there. But if you like...
I'm quite illiterate in this matter. Yes,
yeah.
I can read the questions.
Namita, if you could.
Okay, so we have from Kala, Sridhar, there is an important question, a quick question about Aparna and Anindita. Would you take this up? Aparna, who are the urban poor, how they have been defined? The slum dwellers.
Aparna, you want to go? You are on mute.
Go ahead.
The question is, who are the urban poor? How are they defined? The slum dwellers. As we know, there are many poor who live outside the slums and many non-poor who live in the slum, as a case of Mumbai would show. Kala, for Orissa, the definition is 180,000 family income per annum is where they have fixed it. Slum outside, anywhere. If you don't have a, for titling, they are doing a fresh slum survey, and they have come up with many more slums than they used to have. So that survey is 2018 that I am referring to, and it talks about 2,000 slums beyond the bigger cities of Orissa. So two definition, one is 180,000 per family per annum, that makes them economically weaker section. And here for the titling, they are prioritizing people who live in slum. So that's, I wanted to say. Some institutional credit is available without collateral, mudra loans. How do you factor that in? So as some other speakers and panelists were saying, and maybe some of the questions also pointed out, Bina, is that, how far the penetration of availability of institutional finance or availability of various typology of products that are available in these areas depends. So Tamil Nadu will have a much better, microfinance setup than Orissa. Orissa doesn't have any. So what we have found that most of them have reported to resort to informal borrowing at a very high rate of interest. Those were the two questions, I think, for me.
Would it be possible for you to answer the question from Veena? What is the share of mudra loans in the household that you have surveyed, and is that a very high component as far as the institutional borrowing is concerned?
Professor Kundu, mudra loans are for livelihood, right? Housing loans, none of the beneficiaries reported for taking housing loan from the mudra scheme. No, we haven't come across.
No, I think what Veena wanted to know, what is the significance of Veena loan in the total institutional credit? Of course, mudra loan is not given for housing as a collateral, but is that a significant source of giving or borrowing for the rural people at least? You have not looked at, in these households that you have surveyed, you have not been able to.
No. Our study is urban and urban slums in Orissa, where there has been any form of public housing subsidy flown. So that's the premise of that data collection. So it did not take into account mudra loans.
Anindita, then let me share one of my concern. I'll tell you, since I've looked at the Prime Minister's Awas Yojana, the 4 verticals. It announced the massive program for slum rehabilitation. That was the first vertical. And they said 70% of the dwelling units will be really for slum rehabilitation. The second, third, fourth component one is affordable housing with PPP model. Third is this credit linked loan, which was quite high, 2.3 lakh per household. And the fourth is this beneficiary led construction who have the land title. And when I analyze the data up to 2019, I find that slum rehabilitation has got the lowest, because they say, well, land is a big issue, we cannot give land titles. And do you know 70% of the loans up to 2019 were given for beneficiary-led construction. Those who already have land, they apply within a planned framework. You are given, I think, 1.5 lakh. That is the amount of subsidy that comes from there. I wanted to know why this has happened. Is it possible? You should be in a position to answer this question. This is a constant worry for me. That is it possible that there has been some land subdivision? The people who have got land are not necessarily 100% those who have been given land by the state. Some of them might have got land from somebody else, or there's a Benami transaction, because these people are not getting bank loan. You have mentioned that they're not getting bank loan. Is it possible that a large number of them who actually have land title? I always say, if somebody has a land title for 400 square feet area, the fellow ceases to be a poor in the urban context because the land value is so much. So I was just wondering, what is the secret that beneficiary-led housing construction is great success? Is it really because that poor people have got land title, or there has been Benami transfers, the people have got it and given it to somebody else, or the rich people have subdivided their land by 4 or 5 relatives? How come the beneficiary-led housing, not only in Orissa, in the whole country, has really gone much beyond what was proposed, whereas other components, particularly slum rehabilitation, has not gone up? I just thought you can share your views on that.
Thank you, Professor Kundu. That's a very important question, and we have been asking ourselves as well that what makes beneficiary-led construction such a preferred vertical. I would say in situ slum rehabilitation, how that vertical has been conceptualized and how it kind of prioritizes private sector investment as the way to go for slum rehabilitation, and the low amount of subsidy, that's the lowest under all the 4 verticals, I think has deterred many states from getting into that, because it's complicated.
No, Anindita, the lowest is for slum rehabilitation, 1 lakh. For
That's
this beneficiary, or beneficiary is 1.5.
So the ISSR, Professor Kundu, what I'm trying to say is why ISSR as a vertical, in situ slum rehabilitation as a vertical in itself, couldn't draw a lot of attention are twofold. One is the subsidy is low. So eventually the state share increases because the cost of the unit remains same. And that it's very complicated. It's a private sector participation enabled rehabilitation process. So most of our states, I don't think they're capable enough to do such complex contracts for private participations. Those are the 2 key points that I feel, Professor Kundu, I might be completely off. Please pardon my ignorance if you find that. But those are the 2 critical things I find. For the beneficiary, on the other hand, if we take a beneficiary-led construction as the vertical of choice that the entire country is showing, if we see a little disaggregated data, Professor Kundu, I feel Tamil Nadu is doing very well in beneficiary-led construction. AP is doing very well in. So these are the states of erstwhile land tenure regularization states, and I feel those are the benefits that we are reaping in giving this BLC subsidy, and that's why the BLC numbers are high. The states which did not do earlier are now gearing up. Orissa and Punjab are 2 examples, and the moment you can streamline your land tenure, you can apply for BLC. So it kind of goes hand in hand. I would kind of just point it and then leave it at that. I'm sorry, I'm taking too much time. Is Kerala. A very interesting insight from Kerala, Professor Kundu. They have a mission, life mission, where they are enabling landless households, subsidizing landless households, buy land from the market at a market rate and giving portion of that value as a subsidy so that the poor is able to buy. And in doing that, then they are linking these to the beneficiary-led construction working. So, those the states enable land somehow for the poor are being able to undertake the benefits of BLC vertical. I don't, I don't disagree that there will be some instances of multiple division, son building in the common plot of mother and son. There will be such instances, but I think these are the two key drivers that I feel.
And maybe if I can just add one more observation that, in the small cities, like what we've observed in Puri, Dhenkanal, and all these smaller ones, actually poor people own their land. It is not that, they are, this perception that we have from Mumbai, Delhi, Chennai kind of a situation that they are encroachers or they have got the land from previous, tenure distribution or patta distribution. Is not true, right? Like in the smaller cities, people do own their land, but they may not have gone through the entire process of mutations and everything. So that also is a point, because I think in small cities it is quite successful because people are owning their land. So yeah, it's a combination of things. It's not that only one is, but what we was very surprised in Puri that people were actually owning their land. So that is a kind of for Delhi, Chennai, we think that only rich people own land. It's not always true even in small cities.
Aparna, what I like about this study, that, the De Soto's myth, which somebody wrote in American Economic Review, that land value is lying like a princess. And the moment you kiss by the land title, she wakes up and everything turns rosy, which has been proved to some extent right in many of the Latin American countries. And in the 80s and the 90s, World Bank was really going with the De Soto model everywhere. But we find subsequently, there's a study by Jeff Payne, and I was participating in that, and we clearly showed that land title is not enough. The point which is coming out from the micro level study, both the studies that have been presented. So I personally think that's a very, very important finding, that besides land title, there are other things which are required. And then De Soto came up with the thesis that land title plus some kind of financial support. Even that, what we showed by taking case study of 13 countries with Jeff Payne edited book, that many of them lose their land. Because the moment you give them land title, they can sell it to somebody else. So my therefore question was that in the sample that you have covered in Orissa, the 3 cities, how many of them were getting land under, from the state government, and how many of them had their private land? And is there any way by which we can find out whether the people who got the land actually gave it to somebody else who could give them a price? I just want to know whether it was properly targeted. The beneficiary-led construction, is it really being targeted? Because 70% of the construction under PMAY, which talks about housing for the poor, targeting for the poor. I just wanted to know your answer, that are you happy that actually the poorer households are able to get the land and keep it and get the house constructed?
I would say, like places like in Odisha where the lands were distributed, like these guys, just because they got 1.5 lakhs, they could construct the house. So there was some kind of a ripple. Otherwise, they were having that land and they were waiting, that someday they would put the bricks and mortar together and would construct it. So what you are thinking that, like it was that kind of a scenario, maybe in Tamil Nadu or those areas, but in Odisha, actually the people were, I would say, whatever our sample says, that Behrampur, they were traditionally the owner of the land, and all these Dhenkanal and these places, Gopalpur, they were on the land, but they were not having that paper,
Okay.
So
Last question. In Orissa, let's talk about Orissa. What percent, how many of these samples had land not from the government, but on their own? Do you have that figure? In the sample that you have covered, how many of them had their land on their own, and how many of them were given by the state government under the land title distribution scheme? What would be the division? 50-50? I mean, I just want to know whether private people had owned land, got the land by some method, legal or illegal, and then got access to the 1.5 lakh of subsidy. That is what is my worry. If you have that figure, it will give me confidence that if 90% of them are those who are getting land from the state to benefit from this, then it is being targeted. But if it is 60% who are getting land from private sources, there could be subdivision of land and rich people are giving it to in some benami way. This is a question which we can keep in your mind. But let's see whether we have other questions coming from the panelists. Or Dr. Bide, do you have any other question? Because I find these are the two questions which were there on the screen.
Yeah. No, I don't have any other questions. So, Mr. Sanan, we also have Mr. Krishnan here, KP Krishnan. If he has any questions, I would like to ask him before Mr. Sanan comes in. Dr. Krishnan?
Yeah, 1 minute. Yes, Dr. Bide, good evening to you.
Yeah.
One minute, I have some audio problems. Just give me a minute, sir.
We can hear you.
I can hear you.
Yeah, I have problems. Your voice is breaking. I'll just move it. Yeah. Yeah, Professor Bide, can you repeat what you said, sir?
There has been a lot of discussion on, land rights, land titles alone,
Correct.
do the trick. There's a lot of this discussion on the JAGA program in Orissa also. So if you have any comments on so why the land titles alone won't work, that would be useful.
The two issues that we found when we were looking at this in the Department of Land Resources, on the title part, there are actually two things that we require. One is the textual part, but the more important part is the physical cadastral part. So the difficulty that we found whenever you were planning, for instance, using land as collateral, on which Namita, for instance, spoke at length, the difficulty is identifying the precise parcel of land has been a nightmare in most situations because the survey records are very old and very often the extent will actually turn out to be a good 10 to 12% less than what is recorded. So you don't have clarity of actually the extent of land, its location, and besides the issue relating to title. So the difficulty here are manifold, and that can be set right only if you simultaneously handle the textual and the cadastral part, which is a time-consuming, difficult exercise.
Yeah, I guess Professor Kundu, I guess Dr. Krishnan is adding more complexity to the discussion. Did you hear him? Professor Kundu? I'm not sure if you have lost him. Yeah, so I think I would like to request Mr. Sanan to come in and take this forward.
Dr. Bide, sorry, I had muted myself. So when I spoke, you didn't hear. So let's have Diya, and then I would just comment on the point that Professor Krishnan made. Sorry, I looked at it. I thought that I was keeping this.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor Kundu. Firstly, thank you very much, Namita, for your comprehensive comments. Most of them are well taken. I think that firstly, your comment on, looking at the limitations of the databases that we are relying on, I think is a very pertinent one. It's well taken. We will look to document those as limitations in our paper as well. Just on your question on the GDP, I didn't get to explain it fully in the presentation. The reason we take state level GDP as a proxy for household income is because what we did was run a sample correlation analysis between the state GDP as well as incomes at the household levels, and we found that they were highly correlated. And since we needed a measure at the level of the state, given that the LRSI scores are at a state level,
Good evening, sir.
we chose that. Also, on your question about us looking into why we're perhaps seeing what we're seeing, unfortunately right now we've not been able to do a causality analysis because maybe for the limitations in the data, but perhaps if we have a more more data points in terms of a time series, perhaps maybe we can apply a Granger causality model and see what we're getting from it. But I completely agree. However, in the literature, there are suggestions of why we're perhaps seeing what we're seeing. For example, high levels of informal borrowings, because households are seen to borrow most often in case of emergencies, and in that case, informal finance offers the quickest and most cost-effective solution for credit at that moment. There's also, suggestions in the literature that the ticket size of the loans generally are, it depends, the use of land as collateral depends on the ticket size of the loan. So we generally see that there are smaller ticket size loans happening in India, which are more prevalent than larger ones, and therefore there's no need to use land as collateral. But those are just suggestions in the literature, and we'd be, we'd be very careful before saying that this is the reason why we're seeing what we're seeing. To your last point, and a very pertinent one on looking at access to institutional finance, we are actually in the process of collating information about the presence of financial institutions across states, and we're using RBI data for this. So we're looking at the presence of not only scheduled commercial banks but also PACs and cooperative banks, etc. And we will include them in our model. That's definitely one of the plans we have for the paper, and we were not able to do it in time for the conference, but we have started working on it already, and hopefully we'll get this done soon. So thank you very much, Namita.
Yeah,
Thank you. Thank you.
If I can just come in here, actually, I was struck by the fact that the Kerala example, the use of institutional finance through cooperative banks as opposed to other banks, because you found that despite low LRSI, they had higher, might be another factor to consider as you think about it.
Thank you. I just wanted to mention that there are two papers that I got published in EPW, wherein I looked at the 4 verticals and tried to calculate the benefit cost ratio under each vertical. And we find that benefit cost ratio is the highest for slum rehabilitation program, where the number of dwelling units coming up is very low. And it is lowest in PPP model, the participatory model, where you find that the target is being missed. But we have argued that the component which had maximum subsidy of 2.3 lakhs per household is being targeted specifically for the upper middle class and middle class. The poor are really not being able to get this funding under credit-linked subsidies program. One where I had doubts is this beneficiary-led construction. And I think that is where ground level information is needed to see whether it is really being properly targeted to the poorer section. And I'm very happy that Aparna's paper, Anindita's paper, really look at that. I just wanted to mention one thing about this first paper on this quality of land records. This is also for Professor Uday and Devendra Gupta and others. You see, these 4 components that you have put in this land LSRI, this index, these are being included in the regression model as cardinal variables. I would, and they are, in a regression model, in a logistic regression you apply, I would like to know from the people who are preparing this index, is it really based on qualitative assessment, ordinal values, ranking? Because then its robustness will be questioned. I really do not know. I thought the paper should have given a little more information what how this quality of land data is being generated. Because unless I know that, I'm finding it difficult to comment on the regression results. Whether these 4 components which go into the index are really cardinally robust to be subjected to that kind of a statistical econometric exercise. And the final point is, it is not only the land records quality. What is the access? Is it easily available to anybody who asks for it? What is the governance system? What is the administrative procedure? We know, for example, state level variation. In Gujarat, there is a much larger compliance to income tax. So there are certain state level factors which are there. I just wanted to know whether this index can only just give these 4 components, or does it also include the governance part, accessibility part, costing part, so that becomes a little more meaningful in explaining access to institutional credit. I thought this is an area where needs to be some research needs to be done, and those who are using this index must go deeper into the construction of the very components to be able to come to meaningful conclusions.
Professor Kundu, on another note, I just want to bring this for, I think, this esteemed panel, because from our ground level understanding that it took the entire state administration, a lot of people, and also many agencies like Omidyar Network, also this, there's also Norman Foster Foundation, to distribute 2 to 3 square kilometers of area, not more than that, and 51 LRCs. So, like if you see the state of Odisha and if you see the number of people there, it just, they could only do 51 LRC in this last 2-3 years. So I'm just wondering, what is this entire obsession with the land title? What exactly is the validity, and is it something that there is a larger political economy of it, it's being done for certain purposes? So I think that particular thing also needs to be dissected further, because how can you then scale up such programs? Like it's a very limited in its approach then. So I just thought I will bring this to you, the macro level, like how does it pan out? So
no, Aparna, you are absolutely right. I talked to the joint secretary who was in charge of these 4 verticals. He said that, sorry, we cannot move forward in the integrated slum improvement rehabilitation program because we cannot take the land. We just cannot give it to the slum dwellers. So obviously the beneficiary-led housing, if that has been successful, and if actually land has been given to the poorest sections and they have been able to benefit under PMAY by getting 1.5 lakh, I will be very happy. But I think there's an NGO working in Madhya Pradesh. They come up with this story that large-scale mistargeting is taking place. Other people are getting land from other sources and taking advantage of 1.5 lakh. This is, I think, is an important question which should not be dismissed on the basis of anecdotal evidence, and would certainly look forward to the studies that you are doing of that to come out with definitive conclusion. Any other question from the panelists? Or Professor Bide, anything that you would like to say on the issues that have come up, that have been flagged by Namita also?
Actually, I would like Mr. Sanan to respond to some of these questions. I think he has muted himself right now. Mr. Sanan?
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Bide.
Please.
It's been a very rich discussion today, and it's been really wonderful to see the kind of response we've been getting. We've had, from much of today, over 60 participants. It's been a wonderful and very rich 3 hours, which have already gone by. I hope I'm audible. Huh?
Yes, yes.
So I wanted to just wrap up by saying 2 or 3 things. One, that we are really gratified that LRSI has evoked so much research interest and discussion. Both the gender papers and the later papers on credit have really made us feel that it's been a worthwhile exercise that we've been going through. The Professor Kundu's points on the index preparation, qualitative factors, how well they are able to look at. So one by one, first, yes, the index very much looks at it from the client perspective. So is there access? Is it digitally available on the web to clients? Is it available in a legally usable form or not? Is a very important considerations in giving points in on the LRSI, both for textual and spatial record. Similarly, for the registration process, how much is discretion cut out and the digitally signed registration document is made available quickly to the beneficiaries? How are circle rates actually available in a transparent way online for people to be able to assess how much they have to pay and move forward? On quality, it uses certain proxies for seeing whether ownership is happening real time, whether land use is being shown correctly, whether encumbrances are being recorded or not. All these are actually test checked, apart from, of course, taking information from the states themselves. So it tries its best within the proxies it picks up for the data which is shown digitally. So to answer Namita's point, if you have a great land record like Sikkim has, or maybe J&K has, if you're not displaying it digitally, you cannot get marks on this index. Because the whole idea is that first it must be seen. After that, we'll know whether it's good. But first it has to be even visible. I cannot assess it unless it's visible to me. So, I mean, there is no way I can do that. So that is an important consideration in this. The gender papers really added to my knowledge, and Bhargavi's comments were very insightful. Just to answer one of our points, yes, this was physically, RORs were checked for gender. We had to total, in each case, how many women actually own singly in multiple situations, had to be checked from the samples which we have taken in LRSI of RORs from state after state. And the reason the number of states is small in this is that because of COVID, we had trouble with translation. Otherwise, we would have made it even wider across India to cover more states. It was only translation facilities which have hampered us, but we hope to take it forward in coming years. On the 2 or 3 questions which were raised in this last session, why has beneficiary-led construction gone up? Why has it been a preferred mode in PMAY, etc.? I think as a former administrator, Professor Kundu, my simple answer to you is it is so much easier to implement. It doesn't require either financial or capacity issues. The kind of capacity you need for slum upgradation to structure a good project and the kind of time and effort you have to devote and then come up a cropper and still not get a good result. BLC is so simple. Just hand over the money. You got a title. Nobody can question me. I've given money to a chap who could show a patta or a title, and that person has gone ahead and constructed, had an interest in it. Easiest. Go ahead and do it. So whether it will result in leakage, in poor targeting is a separate question, as you said, which needs to be investigated. But to answer your question, why is it favored? Easiest to implement. Very easy. Every year I can throw out the money and show I'm progressing, I'm doing my work. Number 2, why is informality high in access to credit? Actually, informality is not so high in India. If I look at ADIS data from 1950, when it was 90% informal, the last surveys show it's down to 60%, and it doesn't factor in microfinance. The moment I add microfinance to it as a formal source, if I do, it goes up enormously into the 70s. In actual practice, informality is actually lower than we thought it was. What is low is use of land as collateral. Certainly low, as both papers have pointed out, and we know from anecdotal evidence and some of the work we are doing at NCAER, a paper which we, as I said, because of COVID was not presented today, but already the work has happened on that, shows that certainly use of land as collateral is low. And if that is low, what accounts for that? And I think Diya made some important points on that. Why is collateral possibly low? Use of land as collateral. We need to probably delve a little more into these issues, and we will get more, we need to do more research and find out more answers on these issues. Why DeSoto is not such a big deal in India, I think is an important question. And certainly many of us will smile at this idea, and I think needs to be taken further in our discussion. Thank you very much, everybody, for being so animated and involved in the entire discussion in today. And we look forward to another engrossing final day tomorrow on with some very, very interesting two urban-related papers, which are breaking absolutely new ground here tomorrow on looking at issues which haven't been looked at before, and with their own databases from Kala and from Jayashree. And I'm really glad. By the way, there is a huge gender imbalance in this workshop. The papers are mostly from women. I'm glad.
Deepak, this is what we want. The land title should also be given either in the name of the husband and wife or by woman. Can I take 1 minute, Deepak?
Sir.
I must tell you that DeSoto was almost in India. You know, he came at the invitation of the Ministry of Urban Development, went to Peru, and there was some discussion, but some people did raise some concerns, including myself. And finally, the ministry decided not to toe that line, because just giving land title might lead to, you know, we showed in case of Ahmedabad, there's a large scale displacement that people, they are not able to keep their land because of their various other, you know, requirements of loan. But certainly I am very happy that you gave absolutely acceptable explanation for why the beneficiary-led construction has been successful. It is very easy. And I must tell you that as far as the CLSS is concerned, credit linked subsidies program, where you get massive subsidy for the loans, that will also come up, because it's becoming easy. Earlier, the restriction was that your earnings should be less than 5 lakhs. Now it has become 20 lakhs. You can buy a house which is not being constructed, which is lying vacant for last 10 years. You can buy that also. Your house cost of the housing can be 50 lakhs or even 1 crore. You can buy that and get a subsidy. So something which is easy to do certainly is happening, because they want to meet the target of 11 million housing to be, you know, available. But the basic concern was 95% of the housing shortage is for the poor. It's not just 11 million total dwelling units, but whether we are able to target. And that is one of the concerns which we must keep in our mind. And as far as the index is concerned, I'm really very happy to get to know some of these nitty-gritties. But if, Deepak, you allow me, I would like to come to you as a student and see exactly how the different indicators, which are cardinal, ordinal, or, you know, some of them are really precise measurement, and some of them are ranking, how they are being combined together, what kind of weightage is being given, because this is going to be extremely important study in the land related you know, work that is being done in India. I'm really grateful that NCER has taken this initiative, and I would certainly like to be a student of this and exactly see how this is being done before I'm able to use this in my work. I have already used many of the NCAER indices in my research, and I would certainly look forward to this one being in my research agenda. If there is no other issues, and from chairperson's side, this will be the last comment. And thank you very much for this patient hearing and excellent points which came up, and the explanations which came, and also our discussant raised very many important issues which are also taken very well by the participants. I would like to thank all of you for this wonderful discussion today. Deepak?
Thank you, sir. Thank you. I think we've already exceeded our time. Thank you very much. I look forward to participation tomorrow. Thank you. Dr. Bide, if there's anything else, otherwise we close today and we meet tomorrow.
Yeah, no, Shekhar, would you like to close?
Well, just to say that I'm a very late entrant, but just seeing the excitement in Kundu Saab's voice makes me feel like we're doing the right thing. And seeing the smile on Namita's face also makes me think we're doing the right thing. I think this is a great venture. Hats off to Deepak and Shom and Shashank and DB Gupta for organizing this. I'm sorry, my time has to be spread over many different things. And as some of you know, I'm sitting in the US right now, so I'm in a different time zone. But fantastic work. And Deepak, more power to the kind of bias you referred to, where most of our authors are women. I think that's exactly what Kundu Saab said. We must do the titling in the same way. So this is a step in the right direction. And Aparna, I heard a bit of what you were saying earlier on. So really appreciate greatly everybody's participation. I think today's session was all about inclusion of women, inclusion of those who don't have access to credit. So I think this is exactly the right kind of approach for today's session. And tomorrow is going to be, as Deepak said, very exciting as well. I'm really so glad that we have given birth to this India Land Forum. I think it's going to take off, and it's going to produce a body of understanding and knowledge and evidence that has been so badly needed in our country. And I'm so glad we are doing this. So again, Deepak, thank you so much for doing this. All the best.